Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. It is the afternoon, in this case, of the 20th of October 2024, and you join us today for the latest in the series entitled Stalin on the Opposition. Now, we are looking today at a work entitled Concerning Questions of Leninism that was a work by Stalin from 1926, and you can see there, I've just posted it into the chat so you can all take a look at it. It's reasonably lengthy, but you can probably get through it in about an hour or so. And what this work does is further elaborate upon the view in the Soviet Party at the time of the functioning of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and also it tackled some misunderstandings of the nature and some bad interpretations of the nature of the relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry, and tackled some further errors made by principally Zinoviev regarding the question of socialism in one country. So we'll come to those things later on. But for now, we're starting with the nature of revolution. Now, Stalin goes through a number of points in this, and the principal focus, though, of this work is the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, what is its function? What is it there to do? How is it constructed? How does it actually work in practice in the USSR at this time? Now, before we get to that, Stalin is also responding to, of course, the perpetual hypocrites and cowardly opportunists and traitors known as the Social Democrats. And here he is on, I'll quote now directly from Stalin's work, on page 279 of the selected works edition I'm working off. Stalin comments on the nature of revolution, and he says the following. Can such a radical transformation of the old bourgeois order be achieved without a violent revolution, without the dictatorship of the proletariat? Obviously not. To think that such a revolution can be carried out peacefully within the framework of bourgeois democracy, which is adapted to the rule of the bourgeoisie, means that one has either gone out of one's mind and lost normal human understanding, or has grossly and openly repudiated the proletarian revolution. This thesis must be emphasized all the more strongly and categorically for the reason we are dealing with the proletarian revolution, which for the time being has triumphed in only one country, a country which is surrounded by hostile capitalist countries and the bourgeoisie of which cannot fail to receive the support of international capital. Now, what he's talking about there is it's a direct response principally to the Social Democrats, mainly to, of course, the perpetual opponent within the Social Democrats of the Soviet Union was, of course, Kautsky, though he had faded really by this time. But it's also a response to others in the former Second International parties and the parties of what was called the 2.5 International. So those were parties such as the USPD, the Independent Social Democrats in Germany, who were sort of a forerunner in some respects of the Communist Party of Germany, and others who, whilst they were pacifistic with regard to World War I, had not developed properly the understanding of imperialism that had been put out there by Lenin, and had sort of embraced a woolly pacifism when it came to World War I, and also a fetishism of bourgeois democracy. This was Kautsky's principal criticism, or one of his principal criticisms of the Bolshevik Revolution, was that essentially it hadn't come to power in a bourgeois democratic manner. Now, Kautsky would, of course, and his modern-day defenders, which of course include the DSA and Jacobin magazine, would say that it was all about Kautsky really wanted a truly democratic system. But no, what Kautsky and those who followed him, such as Turati in Italy and the other leaders of the Italian Socialist Party, what they wanted to do was to win power through a bourgeois election and essentially really govern, make some reforms to capitalism. And that was their whole political project. There was still at that stage, even the Second International parties were still talking about socialism, But the trajectory was already very clear that what they wanted to do was to manage capitalism on behalf of the capitalists. The thing was that in Italy, the capitalists wouldn't let them. They preferred Mussolini. Now, this words from Stalin on the violent nature of a revolution. It's violent by nature, and it is violent because, and it has a violent nature because we'd already seen by that stage just what the bourgeoisie were prepared to do to actually retain their power, their private property, their right to appropriate the surplus of society, all of the surplus value, or should we say profit from the surplus value generated by workers. They were prepared to engage men like Mussolini, men like Hitler, their supposed movements, use extreme violence. The Bolsheviks had seen what the bourgeoisie and the Russian social democrats, Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, have been prepared to do to try and literally kill the Soviet Republic, which is, of course, means murdering large numbers of communists in huge numbers, carrying out pogroms, trying to reduce Russia to a state of civil war. So that's what the bourgeoisie are prepared to do to retain their power. And yet you still had people, and you still do at this stage, even now, 100 years later, arguing that the only legitimate way to change anything is to win power through bourgeois democratic channels. Now, leaving aside all of the criticisms of this approach made by Lenin and the book he wrote on this very topic, on the nature of the state, to believe at that stage that you could still move to through gradual reforms to socialism was an act of either colossal influence or outright treachery. And so it's important that Stalin reminds us of that point. And again, the point is still true now. You can't reform a bourgeois system. You can't just, even if you win an election, if you believe that governments actually run countries, then you're very foolish. Even left governments, if they did get elected, would not run the country. Permanent bureaucracies run countries. Permanent bureaucracies which are tied by the interests of the most senior members of them directly to the ruling class and the fortunes of the ruling class. So worth remembering this, especially considering that Stalin's view on this did not change largely until after World War II, when he did talk briefly about the possibility of a peaceful revolution, even in the imperialist countries. He commented that there could be a potential peaceful revolution in Britain, but that was something that was an opinion that went around at the time. Even Clement Attlee commented upon it, not that he had any intention of carrying through any kind of revolution. But that, shall we say, overly optimistic view that Stalin later took just immediately after World War II was rapidly revised in the light of the events that took place after World War II. So by 1946-47, that optimistic view that the Soviet leadership did take for a brief moment in 1945 had gone. So you'll find Trotskyites saying, "Oh, Stalin gave up on revolution. He believed in gradualism, etc." You'll find Soviet and Khrushchevite revisionists these days peddling a similar line. This was like one period immediately after World War II where there had been that alliance against the Nazis with the British and the Americans, and there was this brief period of, frankly, illusions that followed World War II that were given up on and discarded when it became obvious that the bourgeois in Britain, and especially in the United States, were prepared to offer some reforms but were not going to allow the kind of people's democracy to emerge and socialism to be ushered in that way, in the way it was in the east of Europe. So, moving on then to the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And again, this is something which causes controversies to this day, and so therefore the words of Stalin are absolutely crucial here to understand. So next quote I'm going to read through for you is a little bit more lengthy, but it's worth hearing in full. And this is from page 285 in the edition that I'm reading. "Hence," says Stalin, the three main aspects of the dictatorship of the proletariat. One, the utilization of the rule of the proletariat for the suppression of the exploiters, for the defense of the country, for the consolidation of the ties with the proletarians of other lands, and for the development and victory of the revolution in all countries. 2. The utilization of the rule of the proletariat in order to detach the labouring and exploited masses once and for all from the bourgeoisie, to consolidate the alliance of the proletariat with these masses, to draw these masses into the work of socialist construction, and to ensure the state leadership of these masses by the proletariat. 3. The utilization of the rule of the proletariat for the organization of socialism, for the abolition of classes, for the transition to a society without classes, to a socialist society. The proletarian dictatorship is a combination of all these three aspects. No single one of these aspects can be advanced as the sole characteristic feature of the dictatorship of the proletariat. On the other hand, in the circumstances of capitalist encirclement, the absence of even one of these features is sufficient for the dictatorship of the proletariat to cease being a dictatorship. Therefore, not one of these three aspects can be omitted without running the risk of distorting the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Only all these three aspects, taken together, give us the complete and finished concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now let's just go back and look at these again. So, point one, and this is one we generally understand, the utilization of the rule of the proletariat for the suppression of the exploiters, organizing the defense of the country, and for the consolidation of ties with the proletarians of other lands. So, that's the most straightforward and well-known aspect. Suppression of the exploiters, suppression of the capitalists, and all the forces that fight with them, and the organization of the defense of the country. Now, that, of course, was done fairly quickly in the Soviet Union, and it's part of the classic definition of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which we're mostly familiar with. Now, second, where he talks about the utilization of proletarian rule to detach all of the labouring exploited masses once and for all from the bourgeoisie. So that means bringing over to the side of the proletariat the peasantry, the petty bourgeois layers, the lumpens as well will get swept along in this. All of those non-capitalist layers will be brought along should be brought along with the revolution and rally behind the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the job of the proletariat then is to ensure that they lead the state and that they lead an alliance with these other groups in any country. So peasantry being in the Soviet case the most numerous of these classes, but also petty bourgeois, also lumpens, even some rogue bourgeois elements. All of these can join the process of socialist construction. All of these can join the revolution, but they are, of course, subordinate to the role of the proletariat. Now, the use of the dictatorship of the proletariat to then organize the fight for socialism and the abolition of classes. Now, how this has been neglected is rather mysterious, because this is absolutely crucial, because the purpose of the dictatorship of the proletariat, one of its key purposes, is to reorganize the country so that for the fight for socialism. Because, of course, the fight for socialism isn't concluded with the revolution and the bringing of the proletariat to power. It's a long struggle. It's a long process, which every revolution has to go through, and is a constant fight to get there. Now, next part is dealing with how those three elements were actually implemented within the Soviet Union. So what were the methods by 1926 through which the dictatorship of the proletariat was being applied in Soviet Russia? So Stalin says dictatorship of the proletariat consists of 5 what he called transmission belts, which transmit from the masses to the party and back again. So he says these are the trade unions, the Soviets, the cooperatives, the Youth League, and the party itself. So this is the one of the again, it's why I said one of the most crucial things in this essay of Stalin's is this dealing with how the dictatorship of the proletariat is constructed in practice. So I'll read Stalin's summary of these 5 points. The trade unions as the mass organization of the proletariat, linking the party with the class primarily in the sphere of production. The Soviets as the mass organization of the working people, linking the party with the latter primarily in the sphere of the state administration. The cooperatives as the mass organization mainly of the peasantry, linking the party with the peasant masses primarily in the economic sphere, in the sphere of drawing the peasantry into the work of socialist construction. The Youth League as the mass organization of young workers and peasants whose mission it is to help the vanguard of the proletariat in the socialist education of the new generation and in training young reserves. And finally, the party as the main directing force in the system of the dictatorship of the proletariat, whose mission is to lead all these mass organizations. Such in general is the picture of the mechanism of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Without the party as the main guiding force, it is impossible for the dictatorship of the proletariat to be at all durable and firm. Thus, in the words of Lenin, taken as a whole, we have a formally non-communist, flexible and relatively wide and very powerful proletarian apparatus, by means of which the party is closely linked with the class and with the masses, and by means of which, under the leadership of the party, the dictatorship of the class is exercised. Of course, this must not be understood in the sense that the party can or should take the place of the trade unions, the Soviets, and the mass organizations. The party exercises the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, it exercises it not directly, but with the help of the trade unions and through the Soviets and their ramifications. Without these transmission belts, it would be impossible for the dictatorship to be at all firm. So, the point here is that the dictatorship consists of 5 real component parts. Now, let's deal first of all with the role of the trade unions. The role of the trade unions in the Soviet state is to organize production, is to train workers in how to organize production. So trade unions under socialism, under a workers' state, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, they perform a fundamentally different role. The whole way these are set up is completely different than they would be, of course, under capitalism, because what they're doing is that they are, as I said, training workers in the administration of industry. They're educating workers in the planning and execution of production, and they're bringing workers into the system of overall management. So trade unions act as a school both for class-conscious workers and for the next generation of worker administrators of industry. And that's a fundamentally different role than you have under capitalism. Completely different. Under capitalism, and let's just use the English or the British trade unions as the example, these emerge by the 1830s as organizations which are defensive organizations, principally defensive organizations, through which the class is organized to try and enforce or to claim a better deal out of or from the capitalist class, which again, it's a training school of sorts, and they can be training schools for workers in struggle. So a class-conscious worker can develop a trade union consciousness through this struggle. And that consciousness can then go on to become revolutionary if they encounter and become involved with the Revolutionary Party. But again, like trade unions here, they're not about schooling workers in plans of production. Not really. They're not about schooling workers in how to run an enterprise which is integrated into a planned economy. They're not about educating workers as to how to exercise their dictatorship via their workplace down to that level. They're not about training future administrators and industrial managers, which is part of what trade unions in the Soviet state were about. Now, all of that latter part gives the trade unions a completely different character. So when you hear, for instance, Trots or Social Democrats complaining that in the Soviet state there were no free trade unions, well, first of all, there's no such thing as a free trade union under capitalism. But what you had there was trade unions of a fundamentally different character. They're there not to, represent the workers against a hostile employer. What they're there to do is to be part of the exercise of proletarian power. And that includes training class-conscious workers to be part of the management structure of society, part of training workers in how to exercise their power. So that's an absolutely crucial point to understand. The Soviets, we've talked extensively about those before. The cooperatives, these were and remained like part of the setup in agriculture in the Soviet Union. Some of them were subsumed within collective farms, but they remained cooperatives for a long time. The Youth League, of course, as Stalin says, about training young militants to enter into the party and enter into other areas of work. Now, and then you have the party itself. And the party's role is to lead and to coordinate all of this. But in the trade unions and the Soviets and the cooperatives, a lot of the time you're not dealing with people who are members of the Soviet party, not dealing with Communist Party members. You're dealing with people who are non-party. And there were important people within the Soviet state machine, within the Soviet military, who were non-party, who weren't actual formal members of the Communist Party. So you're dealing with a more complicated set of organizations and a more complicated structure than the bastardizations and slanders of the Trots will allow for. So that is interesting because to look at, because what Stalin's outlining there is the means by which the dictatorship is exercised, but also the means by which he and the leadership group around him, which grew to be, by the end of the 20s, Stalin himself, Klement Voroshilov, Lazar Kaganovich, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Mikhail Kalinin. That was the leadership, a large part of the leadership group then. And this is how they saw not just the dictatorship being exercised from day to day, but how future generations of workers were going to be trained in how to administer the economy in the state, how to run the dictatorship of the proletariat. And each of these organizations that Stalin talks about, especially trade unions and Youth League, it's about training workers. It's about upping the educational and the scientific and the technical level of workers so that they can properly exercise the dictatorship. Right. So moving on to the next part, when Stalin makes an important point which leads on from what I've just been saying there, that it's a dictatorship of the class. It's not a dictatorship of the party. The party plays the leading role and the coordinating role. But unless, of course, it is via those methods and organizations I've just gone through, maintaining these very close and consistently strengthened links with the masses, then the party has absolutely no power whatsoever. Now, I want you to bear this in mind when you hear criticisms of the Soviet system saying, it was a horrible dictatorship, the worker had no power. This is what the Trotskyites say. But of course, the worker did have power, a great deal of power, through the trade unions and the Soviets, and the peasants had power through the cooperatives. And the peasants also later had power through the collective farms. They had far more power and control over their work and their community life, especially in this period. And even later, I would argue that strong elements of this, actually did remain in place until the late 80s. Khrushchev did a lot of damage to it. The Brezhnev era didn't improve matters, but it was only really in the Gorbachev era that the final blows were delivered to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yes, Khrushchev declared it over and declared it to be a state of all the people. Completely absurd, completely opportunistic, completely premature announcement on his part. But significant power remained with the trade unions, with the Soviets, with the collective farms and the cooperatives and with the party. So this is why Gorbachev and Yakovlev go all out to destroy what? To destroy the party, because the party is the centerpiece. That is the bit that the part that coordinates and holds these different parts together. Still, even with all the damage done by revisionism, still by the 80s, you still had a lot of worker militants in the party, even though through the Khrushchev and Brezhnev period, a lot of the hierarchy had been bureaucratized. These elements that have been so strong in the Stalin period could not be wholly destroyed by Khrushchev and the revisionists under Brezhnev. So this is why Gorbachev goes all out with his offensive from 87, 88, to destroy the party and to destroy all of these final elements of the dictatorship of the proletariat that still remained in certain forms. This is what he was out to destroy. And that's what makes him what he was, which is an absolute counter-revolutionary. And all of this that I've been talking about here, what the setup in the Stalin period, this is all infinitely more democratic, truly democratic, in a proletarian democratic sense, than any bourgeois democracy anywhere in the world. The worker had more control over the Soviet economy and state between the early 1920s and the mid 1950s than has ever been the case anywhere else in the world. And I'll take that debate with anybody. So he emphasizes the point about again, that it's not a party dictatorship, it's a class dictatorship. And that is, by the way, why Gorbachev and the revisionists aimed all their blows at the party, because they knew that if they undid that, the power of the party at the base level, that would be the final undoing of the remains of the dictatorship over the bourgeoisie. So I'll now read another quote to you about the fact that it's not a party dictatorship, but a class dictatorship. Stalin says the following: "Not a single important decision is arrived at by the mass organizations of the proletariat without guiding directives from the party. That is perfectly true. But does that mean that the dictatorship of the proletariat consists entirely of guiding directives by the party? Does that mean that in view of this, the guiding directives of the party can be identified with the dictatorship of the proletariat? Of course not. The dictatorship of the proletariat consists of the guiding directives of the party, plus the carrying out of these directives by the mass organizations of the proletariat, plus their fulfillment by the population. Here, as you see, we have to deal with a whole series of transitions and intermediary steps, which are by no means unimportant elements of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hence, between the guiding directives of the party and their fulfillment lie the will and actions of those who are led, the will and actions of the class, its willingness or unwillingness to support such directives, its ability or inability to carry out these directives, its ability or inability to carry them out in strict accordance with the demands of the situation. It scarcely needs proof that the party, having taken the leadership into its hands, cannot but reckon with the will, the condition, the level of political consciousness of those who are led, cannot leave out of account the will, the condition, and the level of political consciousness of its class. Therefore, whoever identifies the leading role of the party with the dictatorship of the proletariat substitutes the directives given by the party for the will and actions of the class." And this is something that Stalin will go back to, Mao does as well, over and over and over again. Unless the party is as one with the class, unless the advanced elements of the class are properly in tune with the rest of the class, then there can be no question of the party imposing something which the class is not ready for on it. Which is why, of course, you had to go and spend a significant amount of time preparing the ground for things like the 5-year plan, both in terms of building up of capital and building up of the consciousness of the working class, and also building the ground for collectivization, preparing the ground for collectivization. And Stalin insists over and over again that that there has to be persuasion, that you have to bring over to the side of the party the majority of the working class has to at least acquiesce to this. You have to bring them round, and you can't force them to come round to you. and this is the mistake that Stalin says the Trotskyites were making in the. If you remember, we started this series with the discussion of the role of the trade unions, and Stalin says that the mistake they were making, the Trotskyites, in that was that they were just attempting to force things through via bureaucratic directives, and you can't do that. You have to persuade and demonstrate and educate, and eventually, if the line is correct and it makes sense to the masses will embrace it and run with it, but only once they've been convinced. And this is the difference between Trotsky and the majority in the CPSU in the 20s. Trotsky, Bukharin too, and we'll see Zinoviev and Kamenev also come into this, for whatever democratic clothing they try to wear or whatever democratic language they try to use, when it comes down to it, a lot of the time, they all share this belief that the class, both workers and peasants, had to be dictated to, had to be pushed into things, had to be run things had to be run in a military style. And this was, of course, one reason why Trotsky was very fond of war communism, because he had been able to do that in the Red Army in the Civil War. He wasn't able to do it in the building up of economic capacity in the 1920s, later 1920s. And of course, he never got used to that idea. By the looks of it, Bukharin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev didn't either. But Stalin was what marked him out. And also, to be fair, what marked out Molotov and Kaganovich as well, and Kalinin and Voroshilov, was that they did understand this, that the class would reach a certain position and they needed to be persuaded to take further action. And until you persuaded the class of this, you couldn't do it. Right. Now, moving on and on retaining the confidence of the masses, because this is absolutely crucial in terms of the relationship between the vanguard and the rest of the proletariat. Now, Lenin defines, Stalin says, these mutual relations as mutual confidence between the vanguard of the working class and the mass of the workers. What does this mean? It means, firstly, that the party must closely heed the voice of the masses, that it must pay careful attention to the revolutionary instincts of the masses, that it must study the practice of the struggle of the masses, and on this basis test the correctness of its own policy, that consequently it must not only teach the masses, but must also learn from them. It also means that the party must, day by day, win the confidence of the proletarian masses, that it must, by its policy, primarily and work, secure the support of the masses, that it must not command, but convince the masses, primarily then to realize through their own experience the correctness of the policy of the party, that consequently it must be the guide, the leader, and the teacher of the class. So, bear in mind what he says there. It must not only teach the masses, that is the party must also learn from them. And again, like people credit Mao with that, but Stalin and Lenin were talking about this as well, that the Mao, of course, developed it further. But you must not only seek to educate and guide the masses, but you also must be prepared to be educated by the masses. Again, we see this all fall away, or some of it at least, crucial elements of it fall away in the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods. And this is part of the reason why you get demoralization. And in my view, in the Khrushchev and Brezhnev period, a deliberate attempt by the revisionists to depoliticize the masses. Difference, perhaps the biggest difference between the Stalin period and the revisionist period is what Stalin's talking about here. Consistently politicizing and raising the level of consciousness of the masses is a constant concern for Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and other great revolutionaries. For the Khrushchevites, it's paying off the masses, buying off the masses, demobilizing the masses, ideologically and practically disarming the masses. That's the difference. I think more than anything else, more than any other single thing, that's the difference between a revolutionary and a revisionist or a social democrat. The revolutionary constantly seeks to raise the level of the masses. Why? So that the masses can play their proper role in leading the revolution. And the party goes to the masses teaches and educates in order that the masses can raise themselves further up. Whereas the Khrushchev period is much more about stopping that. And that is a bureaucrat's mentality. Right. So moving then to talk about a couple of other things. And the big one that Stalin also covers in this is the question of socialism in one country. Now, he talks about the relationship with the peasants, but as we talked about that extensively, in the last episode, I'll leave that to one side for now. But he goes back to the question of socialism in one country. And again, he's rather than arguing against Trotsky this time, he's arguing against Zinoviev. Zinoviev argued in one of his books, I believe it was a work he published on Leninism, that whereas the revolution could be defended in one country, that it couldn't reach socialism in one country until there'd been the wider revolution across the advanced capitalist nations. Essentially, Zinoviev had come to take the same view as Trotsky. Now, remember, we've talked before about how Zinoviev and his perpetual sideman, his perpetual support act, Kamenev, were both pessimists. They were pessimists in 1917 that opposed the October Revolution. They were pessimistic about building socialism in the 1920s. And it's no surprise that they went on to agree with Trotsky about the impossibility of building socialism in one country. Now, what Stalin says in argument against Zinoviev was that the possibility was there of building socialism in the USSR, even when surrounded by enemies. So that was a possibility, and that had been, to a certain extent, proved by the middle of the 1920s. The unity of the masses behind the socialist project made it possible to defeat the armies of foreign intervention and start the process of building socialism. And the later victory over Hitlerite fascism also demonstrated the validity of this point. Now, what Stalin says is, yes, we can build socialism in one country, but what's true is that we can't guarantee against forced restoration. That is, restoration of capitalism as a result of campaigns waged from outside by the imperialist powers. So that's true. Now, Stalin never said and never defended this as a point of view that socialism in one country would be absolutely secure. He always made the point that as long as imperialism existed outside of the USSR, as long as there remained powerful capitalist states, that they would seek to bring about capitalist restoration. What he argued was, though, that the Soviet proletariat and peasantry could build socialism, but it would be easier to defend it if the powerful states, capitalist states, powerful imperialist nations outside of the USSR that surrounded it had also gone over to socialism, and that their ruling classes had been defeated. Now, you notice the difference. Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin all argued that it was impossible to build socialism at all in the USSR without a revolution in Germany. Trotsky's obsession was always Germany. We have to get it done in Germany, or we won't get it done anywhere. It was always his thing. And Stalin argues back saying, no, we can build socialism here, but we can't fully secure it without the victory of the revolution in other countries. Notice the difference. You keep the Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky, Bukharin keep going back to absolute pessimism, whereas Stalin's always clear that if we're applying the dictatorship of the proletariat correctly, if we're educating, mobilizing the masses and engaging them, the masses are engaging in the mass organizations, and the party is not only guiding and teaching the masses but learning from the masses, then socialism can be built in one country, however difficult the circumstances are. It's just that to secure it, we require the final overthrow of the imperialists. Again, these are subtleties to a certain extent, but they're very important subtleties. It leads one to radically different conclusions. And it's why you get some people on the left proclaiming that this is all just splitting hairs, but it's not. because you have to clarify these questions, such as the things we've been talking about tonight, such as, well, what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? How does it work? How does it fit around the conceptions of socialism in one country? What is the proper role of the masses in the dictatorship? Is it a dictatorship of the class or a dictatorship of the party? Are the party and the class always synonymous? And Stalin's pretty clear that, like, there's a huge non-party masses that the party through the vanguard needs to lead and therefore needs to bring over to its side. And that's a constant struggle, a constant battle. All of the oppositional tendencies, whether it's Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, their united opposition, which emerges around about this time, or later Bukharin and the united left-right opposition, all of them have a tendency towards bureaucratism, towards commandism, and ultimately towards pessimism and pro-capitalist tendencies. And again, this is what happens when the revisionists got hold of the leadership of the USSR. This is what came in: bureaucratism, commandism, the pushing of the proletariat and peasantry out of leadership, or the attempt to, in the name of democracy and freedom, of course, the democracy of the bourgeois and the freedom of the bourgeois to return and reimpose capitalism in the Soviet Union. So those are the main elements of Stalin's work concerning questions of Leninism. I would encourage all of you to read it in full and submit questions to myself if you want them answering in a future session. It's a very clear and concise explication of the theory and the practice of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and for that reason it is absolutely crucial reading. Right, okay. Let's go through the comments here. Right, I believe this is why I was looking to get other moderators in, because apparently we've had a fascist in the chat, but I've got rid of him now. All right, so greetings to Grassy Knoll, who joins us, and to Anthony from Prague, and to you, Wan, from Phoenix, Arizona, and to Svetlana in Moscow. Christopher Rogers joins us from the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Ian Foster joins us. Good afternoon to you, comrade. More time needed. Good evening to you out there in Skegness. So technically it's good afternoon still. More time needed. We're on the same time zone after all. Greetings to Jerry in Soggy, Hampshire, and to Enigma, and to Protivnik, and to Robert, who joins us from Staten Island, with the Staten Island Wasteland. Lee, good afternoon to you. Kawa Justiniano, hello to you. Muniz, the Rational Colonel, greets us, as does Tim Gray, as does Alina from Western Occupied Germany. And hello to Albert Roundtree. Tim Gray says, in Britain, we still tell ourselves that 1945 government was socialism, forgetting all about the colonialism, repression, capitalism, and anti-communism. Yep, that's most of the British left thinks that. Harry Pollitt says, I wonder if Lenin was president of the United States, he would be able to get anything through the Senate and Supreme Court, or if he was PM, would the Lords and the King stop him? Look, you could put any historical figure you like. You put Julius fucking Caesar in charge of the presidency, and he'd still get impeached. You know, not unless he brought. I mean, he'd have to bring a Praetorian Guard with him and purge the Senate. Like, there's no way that any president trying to act through conventional means could get progressive measures through the Senate or past the Supreme Court. At the very least, you would need to go and be prepared to appeal over the heads of the political leaders to the American masses, and to be prepared to essentially sweep the existing Constitution aside, sweep the Senate and the Supreme Court aside, basically. So you might as well just go the whole way and bring down the whole damn system. Same here. Like, the methods for getting rid of a prime minister here are very well established. Start a capital flight and market panic, and then declare that the prime minister has destabilized the country and should resign for the good of all. And most of the left-wingers who might be in contention for the prime minister's job would happily resign and take a payoff. Again, there's no point in doing it, basically. Yes, I will update the opposition. Thanks, YepX, for the reminder. Svetlana Vladimirova says, bearing in mind that Russia and China embraced socialism after a terrible war, to what extent is war or a terrible cataclysm a prerequisite for successful proletarian revolution? What's a prerequisite is as Lenin observed, that the ruling class can no longer go on ruling in the old way, and that the working class can, or the masses can no longer or refuse to be ruled in the old way. So that's the revolutionary situation. You got more to it than that. Sometimes that's as a result of a war or a collapse, which is what happens with the end of any system. Its failures become too big and too obvious for anybody to avoid. Now, there were opportunities, again, in the 60s and 70s for change of a different nature. There was a time when the proletariat, viewing the changes that had come through the reform period, did react with increased militancy when the ruling class kept trying to take those changes away, those positive reforms away. And this led, of course, to the long period of struggle in Britain and France and Italy, especially those three places, between about 65 to 85, 1965 to 1985, where, again, there was a possibility of fighting for socialism then, because the proletariat could see that reform had gone as far as it could, and that there was a need for greater struggle. But unfortunately, as I've said many times before, there was no Communist Party to organize that struggle, so it all just went nowhere. So what's necessary, to go back to Lenin's point, is that the ruling class can no longer continue ruling in the same old way, and that the proletariat is not prepared to be ruled in the same old way. That's the condition for revolution. Now, that could be war. It could be defeat in a war, like, Napoleon III losing the Franco-Prussian War. Or it could be some other massive failure of the system, such as that which we are experiencing now. Jeremy asks, is there a peasantry in present-day imperialist countries? Pretty much not in this country. You have an agricultural proletariat now, but you don't have a peasantry really anymore in Britain. You have an agricultural proletariat and medium farmers to some small farmers. Most of it's an agricultural proletariat working for agribusiness, though. There's still peasantries in other areas, like smaller and middle peasants in like less developed countries. But in the imperialist countries, no, that's very much a thing of the past. Well, as Stalin says, like the reason why revolutions are violent is because the ruling class refused to give up their power, refused to give up their stranglehold over the economy and society. They refuse to give up their privileges. They start wars. They start civil wars. They try to start ethnic conflicts. They do anything they possibly can to preserve themselves in power. And faced with that, you have no choice but to suppress them. Hello to Luis Gomez out there in Portugal. Hello to Robert out there in Detroit, who's with us on Rumble, where we're live on Rumble, X, and on YouTube. Hello to TL Orca. Hello to James Graham. Hello to Social Emotional Learning with Dr. Donny. That's a rather long-winded name. Listening to us from California. T.G. Wilson says, modern state capitalist regimes combine coercive state apparatuses with many ideological state apparatuses that are less coercive. Education is number one. Took over from the church. Yeah. we've covered before, like the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is all-encompassing and comprehensive. The education system's part of it. The cultural and entertainment complex is part of it. We're going to cover more about that in future episodes. Hello to Dan Kowalik, who joins us from Pittsburgh. Good to have you with us, Dan. Hello to J.R. Shield. T.G. Wilson says, with reference to developing the consciousness of the proletariat, this was core to Gramsci's thought, the subaltern, developing everyone as philosophers. Yeah, there's no reason why everybody, every man and woman cannot be a philosopher of their own kind, cannot be an intellectual of some kind. Intellectual work is not just, turning pages of a book. It can be all kinds of work. But our aim is to develop a human being who is fully rounded in their education, who can engage with philosophy, who can also engage with technical questions of industrial development, of plans of production and things like that, who can engage on multiple different levels. You'll have some people who are inevitably a bit more specialized in some than others, but our aim is to produce wholly rounded men and women who can, again, engage with multiple different problems and who can enjoy multiple different aspects of life as well. Sea of Kronos says, in the USSR, advanced surgical techniques were achieved whereby the patient is frozen to enable difficult surgeries. Interesting. Did not know that. Harry Pollitt says, I read today that the term Great Terror came from Robert Conquest, a chap who worked for the Information Research Department, an anti-communist unit of the British state. Yeah, Conquest was a long-time propagandist. I mean, that's his... Robert Conquest, Richard Pipes, people like that. These are big-time anti-communists. You can find a few details in their books that might be interesting, but these are principally anti-communist propagandists disguised as historians. That's why Conquest got a medal from George W. Bush for services rendered. Again, like the American bourgeois don't just hand those out to anybody. You've got to do with them a service, and Conquest did for many years. Conquest, by the way, was also a close personal friend of Christopher Hitchens. Harry also says Orwell and Bertrand Russell were also in the IRD. Yeah, Orwell was certainly in it. Russell was also a rabid anti-communist. We might look at Bertrand Russell in a future episode because that arsehole needs to be thoroughly exposed for the reactionary he actually was. At Atanas Bogatinov on Twitter says, how did the Union collapse? What was the mechanism behind it? Was it sabotaged by the West? People were poor, luxuries were expensive for the people, life was not good. Well, read the book Socialism Betrayed by Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny for a look at this sort of thing. But as to, we've talked before about how poor people were in the Soviet Union and in the people's democracies. Through looking at it, through studies of living standards, working class to working class, there wasn't that much difference between the life of a Soviet worker, certainly in like in Soviet Russia and Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states. Maybe, I mean, it was the Central Asian states were probably a little bit worse off, but not by that much. There was, I think, there was probably worse off areas in Russia, in the RSFSR. The further east you went, the Central Asian countries became a bit of a mono economy, so that was unbalanced. There was some lack of development there as well. But in terms of the life of the working class in the most developed parts of the Soviet Union, doesn't look to me all that much different to the life that many of us grew up in. I mean, for most of the working class that grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they all grew up in small homes. The most luxurious for the working class was like a semi-detached house. I mean, that was like a little bit more than what some workers in the Soviet Union had. But in terms of direct comparison, we weren't all that much different. Most people in this country couldn't afford luxury goods either. Like the luxury goods that they could afford when I was a kid was like what? One television, a radio, like a car which you had to go into massive amounts of debt to pay for. So this perception that luxuries were common in the West, this is propaganda. Most workers couldn't afford them. Still can't to this day. You can go in debt to buy them if you want. And I don't agree with this idea that the people in the Soviet Union were all poor. I mean, this is again propaganda. Like their standard of living was about on a par with ours. It was certainly more secure. And as to for people being poor, poverty increased after the Union collapsed dramatically. What happened was a few absolute compradors were able to grab a load of wealth, but for most of the working class, poverty increased. So I think your characterization itself is suffering from a certain element of bourgeois propaganda, anti-communist propaganda, because I don't agree with this idea that people in the people's democracies were all poor and couldn't afford anything. Like life for them was about on a par with the average of the working class in the West. Not the uppermost end of the working class, I'll say that. But certainly their position was superior to ours in that they had an infinitely more secure life than we did, and certainly than we do now. Right, scrolling through some comments. What would have the Soviet life look like if they hadn't had to use all the resources to fight the Nazis? Asks Tim Gray. And without that war, I wonder what the West would be now, I wonder. Well, it's an interesting one because without that war, then the West would arguably have not recovered from the Great Depression. I mean, without that war, like the most class-conscious workers in the Soviet Union wouldn't have been killed in huge numbers. And it wouldn't have been as easy for the revisionists to take over as a result. So it damaged the Soviet Union in many ways. They recovered magnificently from it. But I think it made the job of the revisionists easier to do, both in the West and in the East. We could do a what-if episode in the future here. Just scrolling through some comments here. T.G. Wilson says, much of Chomsky comes from Gramsci, in my opinion. Manufacturing consent is a simplistic derivation of Gramsci's more nuanced concepts of superstructure and ideology theory. Chomsky is a rip-off artist. You heard it here, folks. But yeah, I agree with T.G. Wilson's point. I think he's wildly overrated. Christopher Rogers says it's rather difficult to raise living standards if you are facing off against enemies on your borders. The British and the US were planning a Cold War as early as 1943. Just look at when the IRD was founded. This is true, but they did consistently raise living standards all the way from the beginning of the 20s all the way through to the beginning of the 80s. Our living standards for the proletariat, even in the revisionist period, did keep improving. So again, like this idea that, oh well, they're all desperately poor because the workers over there couldn't live like essentially the labor aristocracy does over here. But again, or the petty bourgeois do over here. But again, most people over here could never live like that. What the propaganda from the West did was it took the privileges that the uppermost layers of the proletariat did, or the labor aristocracy gained after World War II, and that, you know, there's some elements of the petty bourgeoisie had, and they pretended that was the norm. It never was. Like, you go to a mining village in Yorkshire in like 1965. Yes, You have some people who are slightly better off there, but most of the people involved in the mining industry remained living in like relatively small miners' houses. You got some better paid miners doing slightly better, but again, most were still living in like relatively solid, but like not spectacular housing. Most people who worked in the city, lived and worked in the cities, lived either in terraced housing or small flats, very small flats, often poorly built. And like this idea that everybody was living in like with a detached house and with two cars, I mean, this was never true. It's not true now either. Again, like the propaganda that the bourgeoisie got out of the post-war boom was that they took the most well-paid section of the proletariat and tried to make them into the propaganda for how workers could live under capitalism. And sadly, too many fell for it. Right, okay. Keel Jones says, Chomsky was the dissident that we were allowed by the establishment to like in the US. Yes, very much a curated dissident there. Right, okay. So, going to draw things to a close for today. We've done an hour just on Stalin here. The next time I'll be joining you is tomorrow, when I'll be back with the update on the Ukraine war, and that'll be probably going to do that at the same time tomorrow. So if you join me from around about 4 p.m. tomorrow till 6, we're going to be looking at all things Ukraine related, and then on Tuesday going to be looking at the West Asian update. So join me for both of those things. Thank you for joining me today. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. This program will be available in audio form there, and it will be added to the relevant playlist. Thanks again to everybody who's tuned in and contributed to the chat. I'll be back with you tomorrow. Until then, here's some music.
Nad twoim ljudima vlada, i tvom rudaru, i tvome rataru. Mir graditelju, i tvom čuvaru, mir tvojoj sreći, u vodi i u zraku. U pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju života.